Most of us are taught how to keep moving, build the business, raise the family, lead the team, serve the people, solve the problem, make the decision, how to keep going. But life doesn't always move cleanly from season to season. Sometimes there's a gap. And not every gap is empty. Some gaps are diagnostic. So today I want to consider a simple question. What gap are you in? Because different gaps require different responses. And if you misname the gap that you're in, then you'll automatically choose the wrong solution. I'm Garrick Francis. This is Inheritance to Income Podcast, where we help families, founders, and leaders develop people and systems, not just assets, for what comes next. Because what you build only becomes legacy when people are prepared to carry it. Today, we're going to talk about the gaps. And when we started to build this episode, we realized that there are two distinct types of gaps. There are personal and next chapter gaps, and there are people and system gaps. So we decided we're going to break those into two parts. And so this is the first episode where we're going to deal with the gaps that show up when life and leadership and family and responsibility begin to change seasons, to talk about what comes next. And different gaps require different responses. Once you have the language, you can stop treating every gap like it's the same problem, and you can focus in on the correct solution. So at the end of this, I hope you'll be thinking about, what gap am I in? And first I want to talk about what I call the trigger. The trigger is not always the gap. The trigger sometimes reveals that gap. A business sale may reveal an identity gap. A health scare may reveal a deployment gap. A layoff may reveal a knowledge or opportunity gap. Children leaving home when they grow up and you empty nest may reveal a meaning gap. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the events that get your attention. And the event may not be the actual issue. So these triggers will come from a number of different places. Some of us have been laid off. That could be a trigger. A particular health diagnosis, a conflict, or a door closing. You tend to ask, what happened or what's happening? And that's when you start to go deeper. What did this really reveal? And so today, we start with the personal gaps inside the founder, the leader, or the builder, and we try and identify those. And so the first one, it really is just that. It's the identity gap. And the identity gap is between kind of where you were in your last season and who you're becoming in your next season. And the core question you start to ask yourself is, who am I when I'm no longer needed in the same way that I am today? And that may be you have energy and you have wisdom and you have an ability, but the old you just no longer fits. And you're looking for something different, but you don't know what it is. Sometimes in a job, for instance, the old title ends before the old identity releases you. And you miss being needed more than you miss the actual work. Or you say you want freedom, but it feels strange when you start to realize what that freedom really means. You start something too quickly to avoid the question, who am I now? And the business that gave you rhythm, control, significance, usefulness, and a place where your judgment really mattered, all of a sudden you leave the role before the role leaves you. You don't know who you are. And you don't know, is that all that I ever was? Working in that job or in that career or in that business, I have a lot more to offer and to give. So what happens next? You need to let your identity catch up with your season. And so sometimes what people call a retirement problem is really an identity gap. Sometimes people say, I'm bored. It might be an identity gap. And sometimes people say, I just need another project. And that's the discomfort of not being needed in the same way. And this usually requires an amount of reflection and honesty, and in fact, some grace. But if you don't name the identity gap, you may try to solve it by just taking on another assignment, by overworking or over controlling or starting something just to avoid the reflection. The next question becomes not just what do I do, it's who am I becoming? This isn't this isn't about panic. It's not about achieving another title, the first mountain stuff we've talked about. It's not about overworking or over controlling. It's really about asking what usefulness looks like in my new season. How do I do those things? And so then you come to what I call the legacy deployment gap. I've talked about the legacy deployment gap before, and I'll link the fuller episode in the show notes. But for today, I want to place it inside the broader, what I call gap map. The legacy deployment gap is that gap between what you've accumulated and the wisdom, the skills, the finances, and what you've actually deployed into your life, the family, the stewardship, the future responsibility. The core question in the legacy development gap is, what should the things I've built make possible for me and for the next generation? And accumulation here is not the same as deployment. Succession only, as I've said, succession only becomes legacy when you have a purpose and an intent and a handoff. So you tend to ask, what was all this for? You're not broke, but you're not really fully directed yet. And you have success behind you, but no clear assignment in front of you. And so that's why I pull in the give, live, steward framework to talk about what am I called to give, to live, and to steward. Because those are unanswered questions. And so again, we'll link that in the show notes. But in this, there's a legacy that stops being a trophy and becomes responsibility. And you think about things like, what should the things I've built stand for? What should they enable in the next generation so that the next generation doesn't have to start over? Gap 3 is what's known as the knowledge or opportunity gap. And this is the gap between wanting more and knowing enough about the next opportunity or the need or the market that you want to address in the assignment, and having enough knowledge and wisdom to move wisely. The core question here becomes, what do I need to learn, to notice, or to test before I make that next move? And so one of the folks I work with in the My Seven Figure Podcast community, he says you got to fill the not gap. You have to do what everybody else is not doing. And so some gaps, they're not telling you to stop, but they're inviting you to study that next need. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to deploy everything immediately, but you have ideas, but not enough information. And you keep saying somebody should do something about that. It's a gnawing feeling that you want to fill that not gap. And sometimes you do need to re-aim, but sometimes you need to step back first and learn a new skill, learn a new market, learn a new opportunity, because you may be confusing excitement with readiness. And you don't want to make these moves impulsively. There's a difference between just getting started and jumping in when you have the knowledge and being impulsive. And so we want to make sure that we put some guardrails around it. And so you want to understand the gaps that you're in. And so when I talk about the opportunity gap, sometimes that gap is not saying go launch. Sometimes it's saying go listen, go find out, go research, go prepare for what's coming next. You may be at a latter stage in your career thinking about the next step, the thing I don't like to call retirement, because retirement means withdrawal. You may be looking for your family or your community or your market or your stewardship needs. You may be thinking about what that next season will require of you. And so the next assignment could be hidden in what others aren't doing. But there takes a bit of reflection and a bit of time to gather the right information to match up your skills to that opportunity. It's not necessarily a jump first, build later scenario. And let me take a second here. If this conversation is helping you name something in your own life or your family or a leadership season, share it with someone who may need to hear it or may need to consider what gap they're in. And if inheritance to income is helping you think differently about legacy and responsibility and stewardship, we'd really encourage you to like, share, subscribe, so that this message can continue to grow and be continued to find legs out in the world. If this message helps reach more founders, leaders, and families, we want it to reach them before that gap therein becomes a crisis. I'd also like to take a second here to pause for a quick word from our sponsor. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Inheritance to Income. Inheritance to Income is brought to you by Garrick Francis Studios. Whether you're preserving something for the future or creating something for today, photography, videography, and editing. Check out the link in the show notes below or check garrickfrancisstudios.com. So let's return now to the conversation. Gap 4. Gap 4 is what I call the meaning, faith, and purpose gap. The meaning, faith, and purpose gap is the gap between activity and meaning, between busyness and engagement and purpose, between success and a calling, between what changed and what should guide you into the next season. You have scaled the first mountain. You've made what the world said you should make, but now you're thinking about, am I living my purpose? What should guide my next season? For those who operate from a faith perspective as I do, the question may also be, what is God purposing me to do in my next season? What wisdom is God giving me so that I can steward things forward? What am I'm asking now to pay my soul? In this gap, you're busy, but you're not clear that you're living according to your purpose. Activity can actually mean hiding the purpose, meaning, and faith gap. You're successful, but maybe you're not satisfied with your day-to-day anymore. Your old measures of success, the titles, the awards, they just don't motivate you anymore. You're asking, what am I carrying now? And what do I carry forward? You sense that your God has given you a greater purpose, a next purpose, but you're having a little bit of difficulty identifying exactly which way to go. The next season doesn't only need a plan, it needs a why. And so when people ask you your why, you're no longer certain. It needs an adjustment. It needs a growth. It needs a maturity to help you get into your next season, your purpose as it grows and matures. Remember, a full calendar is not a calling. And so some people in this gap, this is deeply connected to their faith. This is where they take time to meditate, to pray, to find counsel. And for others, it shows up as purpose and meaning and contribution, a calling to volunteer or to give back to others who may not be as fortunate as you are. But almost every major transition eventually asks a meaning question. And sometimes the danger is not doing nothing. The danger is that you're doing too much without knowing why you're doing it. And for some gaps, like this one, the most important work is not acceleration. For the meaning and faith and purpose gap, it's discernment. It's taking the time to understand and to explore and to listen to what your next season and your next calling may be. And so this is the gap where you start to ask questions about what do I do next, and why does that matter? To whom does it matter? What am I being asked to steward, and what should I release? What should I let go of? What's no longer part of my assignment? And as I mentioned, this requires discernment, prayer, wise counsel, reflection, and just a number of stewardship questions that a lot of us are unaccustomed to having. I briefly want to touch on one additional gap in this personal and next chapter seasons, and that's a wealth or an income gap. This is the gap between the life you're trying to design and the resources and income structure and assets and financial clarity you need to support it. I'm not here to solve this gap today. This one may require the right financial, tax, legal, and planning professionals, some of whom we've had on the show in previous episodes. And those people are well versed in helping you deal with that wealth and income gap. But it also may be a symptom of other gaps that you're in right now. You want to step back, but you don't really have the income to replace your current job or your current business. And you want to give and to travel and to do a number of things, but you're not quite sure that your assets are where they need to be. You have assets, but not liquidity, or you have income, but you don't think you have the freedom to use it. You're making purpose decisions while quietly carrying some financial burden. Those are things that professionals, financial professionals, CPAs, certified financial professionals, and accountants can help you with. And naming that financial gap takes some wisdom. And seeking the right type of counsel is also a really smart move. So today we've been looking really at the personal and next chapter gaps. The identity gap asks, who am I becoming? The deployment gap asks, what should I do with what I've built? The knowledge and opportunity gap says, what do I need to learn or notice and test before I move? And what need is not being fulfilled that I'm capable of fulfilling? And the meaning, faith, and purpose gap asks, what should guide my next season? Who am I becoming? And so not every gap requires a response. And you certainly may be experiencing more than one gap. But that's why naming the gap matters. If you misname the gap that you're currently in, you may choose the wrong solution. You may choose the wrong pathway. And you may feel as though you're stuck. I've tried that before. But the solution you're employing is not aligned with the gap that you're trying to fill. So what I think needs to happen here is that today I would ask you to do one thing. If one of these gaps names something that you're living through, I want you to write this sentence down. The gap I'm currently in is, and then you list it. You name it. The identity gap, the deployment gap, the meaning gap, or the opportunity gap. Which one might you be currently in? Which one is taking the most time? Taking the most time away from your sleep or your enjoyment of your daily activities. And if you think through what you are being invited to give, what you're being invited to live, and what you're being invited to steward for the next season, it will help you look at what gap you might be in. And if we can help you, you can find the next step at www.francislbp.com. So naming is not everything, but it's often a good first step. And the next step is not always creating a full plan. Sometimes the next step is simply the right reflection or the right unaccustomed conversation. But as I mentioned earlier, when we started breaking down the gap map, when we started doing our gap analysis of a sort, we realize that there are different types of gaps. There's the personal and next chapter gap, and then there's the seasons of life gap, the transition gaps. So some gaps are not only personal, they show up when other people now have to carry that responsibility, and that's where the transitions get much more challenging. And legacy is never just personal. Eventually, somebody else has to carry something by default or by design. And you have to start asking yourself, are the people that I am preparing, are they ready to carry what I am about to hand over? Who else carries what comes next? Do they have the authority to make the decisions? And so that's what you want to begin thinking about as you address the gaps. And so just remember, we are identifying our gap, and we all have them. But the gap is not always the enemy. Sometimes the gap is where life slows down long enough for you to recognize the truth, to recognize the season that you're in, to recognize that something changed, something ended, something shifted, something no longer fits who you're becoming. Something needs to be studied, something needs to be reordered, re-aimed, repurposed. Something needs to be designed. And sometimes the most responsible, legacy-minded thing you can do is not to rush forward. It's simply to name where you are. It's to name the season that you're in. It's to name the confusion. It's to name the pain. Because the first job is not to fill the gap. The first job is to name it. And gaps are not punishment. Sometimes they're just invitation to pay attention to what you're about to walk into. They're a warning sign. A gap sometimes can feel like delay, but sometimes it's just preparation. It's where you're able to develop the knowledge and the intention to move forward. You don't have to rush past it to prove that you're strong. In fact, my grandfather used to tell me that his mother said, strong men don't have to hurry. And today, obviously, it means strong men and women don't have to hurry. We don't have to rush, but we do have to be intentional. And so the first job is naming the gap you're in. And so I hope you'll join us again as we seek to discuss some of the other gaps that we may be facing in life. I want to thank you for the time that you've granted me. I don't take it lightly. God bless.